The sun was merciless that day, glaring down over the wide, barren stretch of desert like an unforgiving judge. Isabella's throat burned with the heat, every breath tasting of dust and despair. The wagon wheels creaked one last time, rattling against the dry earth as her family's carriage rolled away. She stood frozen where they had pushed her out, her small satchel clutched tightly in her hands, as though its thin fabric could shield her from the reality settling over her heart. Her mother hadn't looked back. Her father hadn't spoken a word. Only her younger brother had glanced over his shoulder for the briefest second. But even he lowered his eyes quickly when their father barked at the horses to move faster. Isabella had been discarded, left standing in the sweltering heat like some unwanted burden. Dust swirled around her boots, coating the hem of her plain dress. The only one she had, faded from too many washings. Some might have called a wedding dress once, though no vows had ever been spoken over it. Her family had hoped to marry her off, but no man had wanted her. They whispered she was plain, cursed with an unlucky face, and her silence in the face of their cruelty only made her easier to ignore. When no suitor came forward, her family made their choice. She was one less mouth to feed. The wheels of the wagon grew smaller, the wooden frame shrinking into a blur against the horizon. Isabella stumbled a step forward, then stopped, her voice breaking into the empty air. "Please wait." But the wind carried her words away, swallowing them whole. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, harsh and final. "You're no good to anyone. Better you stay here than drag us all down." Her knees buckled beneath her. The leather strap of her bag slipped from her shoulder, dropping into the dust as she pressed her trembling hands against her face. The desert stretched endless in every direction, the horizon shimmering with heat waves, offering no promise of shade, no whisper of mercy. A sob tore from her throat. It wasn't the quiet tears of someone used to sadness. Isabella had known those for years. This was different. This was grief, raw and sharp, the sound of someone realizing they had truly been cast aside, unwanted not just by strangers, but by their own blood. She pressed her palms into the grit beneath her, as though grounding herself to the earth could stop the spinning in her head. Hours dragged like chains. The sun burned hotter, the silence pressing down heavy. Isabella staggered her feet and began to walk, though she didn't know where. Each step sank into the powdery soil, her shadow stretching long across the ground like a reminder of her isolation. She clutched her bag tighter, though there was little inside, just a worn ribbon, a small comb, and half a piece of stale bread. She thought of her mother's cold eyes, of her father's final command, and each memory cut like a knife. She had always tried to be useful, mending, cooking, even caring for the little ones, but somehow it had never been enough. She was too quiet, too different, too unwanted. The air shimmered ahead, mocking her with the illusion of water. Sweat trickled down her back, dampening her dress until the fabric clung uncomfortably. Her lips cracked with dryness, and still she pressed forward, though every step felt heavier than the last. She remembered stories of people lost in the desert, their bones bleaching beneath the endless sky. She wondered if that would be her too. Her legs finally gave out, sending her crumpling to the ground. Dust puffed up around her, stinging her eyes. She lay there on her side, cheek pressed against the burning soil, the tiny satchel still hugged against her chest like the last tether to her humanity. Her breaths came shallow, ragged. She whispered a prayer, though she doubted God listened to girls like her anymore. The desert was silent, but not empty. She heard the fading echo of wagon wheels still rolling in her imagination, long after they had vanished beyond sight. That sound haunted her, circling in her mind until it became the cruelest kind of lullaby. The sound of abandonment. Isabella closed her eyes. The heat, the dust, the silence pressing until everything blurred together. She told herself she wouldn't cry anymore. She had wasted too many tears on people who never wanted her. Yet as the last trace of her family disappeared into the horizon, a single tear slid down her cheek, carving a path through the dirt on her skin. The desert claimed her silence, leaving nothing but the whisper of wind and the echo of wagon wheels fading into forever. The desert stretched in endless silence, broken only by the slow, steady rhythm of hooves pressing against the dry earth. Ethan rode with the ease of a man who had spent most of his life in the saddle. His broad shoulders were bent slightly forward, his hat pulled low to shade his eyes from the merciless sun. The years had carved lines across his face, each one etched with loss and grit. He wasn't an old man, but grief had a way of aging him faster than the desert ever could. He had once laughed freely, once spoken more than a handful of words in a day, but that was before tragedy hollowed him out. Since then, silence had been his companion. The leather reins creaked softly in his hand, his horse snorting as it carried them forward across the wide emptiness. Ethan had no destination, not really. He told himself he rode for supplies, for work, for anything that would keep him moving. But in truth, he rode because standing still meant remembering, and remembering was more dangerous than any outlaw or storm. As the sun climbed higher, something broke the monotony of sand and stone. At first, Ethan thought it was nothing more than a tumble of cloth, maybe a discarded rag caught on the wind. But as his horse drew closer, the shape became clearer. It was a woman, crumpled near a jagged rock, her small frame half hidden by dust. Her hand clutched a satchel as though it were her last anchor to the world. Ethan pulled gently on the reins, his horse slowing to a stop. He dismounted with the careful precision of a man who never wasted energy. His boots crunched against the ground as he approached her, shadows shifting beneath his brimmed hat. The sight struck something inside him, an echo of another body lying still, another sunburned face drained of life. He pushed the memory down, the old wound throbbing, and crouched beside her. The girl's lips were cracked, her face streaked with dirt and tears. Her breaths were shallow, broken. She stirred faintly as a shadow fell over her, her lashes fluttering before her eyes, opened in a dazed confusion. For a moment, fear sparked in them. Fear so sharp it was almost familiar. Ethan didn't speak at first. He reached for the canteen at his belt, unscrewed the lid, and tilted it toward her lips. "Easy," he muttered, his voice rough from disuse. She swallowed greedily, the water spilling down her chin, and he let her drink until her hands trembled from exhaustion. The desert wind kicked up, swirling dust around them. Ethan shifted, shielding her with his frame, his wide hat casting shade over her fragile body. She whispered something he couldn't quite hear, maybe a name, maybe a plea. But her voice broke, and only silence followed. Without hesitation, he slipped one arm beneath her knees and the other around her back. She was lighter than he expected, almost weightless, as if the desert had already begun to claim her. Ethan stood, lifting her easily, his muscles tensing under the effort, but his grip steady and sure. He carried her toward his horse, the animal stamping the ground as though sensing the urgency. He placed her gently across the saddle, then swung up behind her, his strong arm steadying her limp form. She sagged against him, her cheek brushing the rough fabric of his shirt, and he felt her shiver despite the heat. Ethan clicked his tongue, nudging the horse forward, the reins loose but guided by instinct. For a long while, he said nothing. Words weren't his way. Instead, he focused on keeping her upright, shielding her from the sun as much as he could, and listening to the sound of her fragile breathing. Every rise and fall of her chest was a reminder that she was alive, that he had reached her in time. Finally, as the horizon stretched endless before them, he spoke in a low, steady tone that carried more weight than any speech could. "You're safe now." The words were simple, but they hung in the air like a vow. He didn't promise forever, didn't offer explanations or reasons. He just gave her the one truth he could stand by, that as long as she was in his arms, no harm would come to her. Isabella, though barely conscious, heard them, and in her parched, weary soul, those words were a spark, the first sign of shelter after a storm she thought might swallow her whole. The desert swallowed their tracks as they rode on, the wagon wheels that had abandoned her already lost to memory. But the sound of hoofbeats, steady and strong, became the rhythm of something new, a second chance, carried in silence. The sun had already begun its descent when Ethan finally guided his horse toward the rise that overlooked his ranch. From a distance, the land seemed lonely, stretches of dry pasture bordered by weather-worn fences, a barn that bore the marks of years, and a cabin standing with the stubbornness of its owner. Yet, despite its solitude, there was order here, care carved into every detail. The fences were mended, the barn door straight, and the path to the porch swept clean of dust. This place carried silence, but it was not the cruel silence of abandonment. It was the quiet of a man who kept moving, who still believed in work even when his heart had gone still. Isabella stirred faintly against him, her head shifting on his chest as if she sensed a shift from barren desert to human dwelling. Ethan tightened his arm around her, steadying her weak body as his horse slowed to a stop. Swinging down, he lifted her carefully into his arms once more. She was light, too light, her frame trembling even in unconsciousness. He carried her toward the cabin, boots striking the wooden porch with a steady rhythm that echoed to the still evening air. Inside, the cabin was simple but clean. Wooden floors swept smooth, shelves lined with essentials, and the faint scent of wood smoke lingering in the walls. Ethan carried her straight to the small room he had prepared long ago, a guest room that had remained untouched, waiting without purpose. The bed was neatly made, a pitcher of fresh water resting on the table, a folded quilt lying across the chair. It was not lavish, but it was safe, and for Ethan, safety was worth more than gold. He laid Isabella gently on the bed, adjusting the pillow beneath her head. For a moment, he stood there, silent, studying the fragile figure who had been cast aside and nearly lost the desert. Her face was pale beneath the dirt, her lips still cracked, her hands clutching instinctively at the satchel she had carried even in her collapse. Ethan didn't pry it away. He knew the weight of holding onto the last thing that felt like yours. When her eyes fluttered open, confusion clouded them at first. She blinked rapidly, tried to understand where she was, her gaze moving across the wooden ceiling, the small table, the soft light of the lamp Ethan had lit. Then her eyes landed on him, and fear jolted through her body. She tried to sit up, her voice breaking in a whisper. What do you want from me?" Ethan's jaw tightened, not from anger but from the familiar sting of mistrust. He crouched beside the bed, his rough hands resting on his knees, and spoke in a quiet, steady tone that carried no demand, no weight but truth. "You owe me nothing," he said. "This room is yours. Rest." The word struck her harder than any cruelty ever had. She searched his face for mockery, for the hidden price that men always seem to demand. But she found none. His eyes, though shadowed by grief, held nothing but calm resolve. It startled her more than the desert silence had. It was the first time she had been given something without condition. Her throat tightened, tears pricking her eyes though she willed them not to fall. Slowly, she sank back against the pillow, too weak to argue, too shocked to believe. Her fingers loosened slightly on the satchel, and for the first time in years she let go, just enough to let her body rest. Ethan stood, adjusting the quilt so it covered her shoulders, then stepped back. He didn't linger, didn't crowd the room. Instead, he lit the small lantern by the window, letting its warm glow fill the space, and left the door open a crack before walking away. His footsteps faded down the hall, replaced by the faint creak of a chair on the porch as he took his usual place beneath the fading sky. Isabella lay in the quiet, her chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. The cabin felt different than the desert. It wasn't heavy with loneliness, but steady, like the low hum of safety she had never known. She turned her head to the side, the lantern's glow softening the rough edges of her fear. The last thing she remembered before sleep took her was the sound of the man outside, the silent cowboy who had said so little, but whose actions had already spoken louder than the world ever had. For the first time, she closed her eyes without wondering if she would wake to cruelty. The night was quiet, yet Isabella's mind was anything but. The cabin creaked softly as the wind pressed against its wooden frame, but inside her room the silence only made her thoughts louder. Sleep had carried her for a few hours, but when she stirred awake, the ghosts of her past came rushing back with ruthless clarity. She curled on the bed, staring at the faint flicker of the lantern light, and the voices she had tried to bury rose from memory. "Useless girl. Too plain, too ugly. No man will want you. Nothing but a burden." Each word struck her again as if her family still stood over her, casting her aside not for survival, but for shame. Her chest tightened, and her hand instinctively lifted to her cheek, brushing against a faint scar near her temple, a mark she had carried since childhood, the mark her family said made her damaged. She rose unsteadily, crossed into the small mirror resting against the wall. Its glass was warped in places, but reflected enough. She studied the reflection, searching for what they had seen all her life. The sunburned skin, the hollow cheeks, the scar that drew her eye every time she dared to look. Her throat closed. They were right, she whispered to herself, bitterness and sorrow entwined. No one wanted me. Not then, not ever. Her fingers pressed against the cool wood of the dresser as her knees threatened to give. The floor creaked outside her door, steady, purposeful. She froze, expecting a knock, a question, a demand. But none came. Instead, after a pause, something soft touched the floorboards. She opened the door a crack and found a folded blanket set neatly by the threshold, and beside it, a plate with bread and roasted beans still warm. No words, no questions, just quiet provision. Her eyes stung as she picked up the blanket, clutching it against her chest. Ethan hadn't looked at her reflection, hadn't pointed out her scars, hadn't demanded thanks. He had simply seen a need and met it, without intruding on the storm inside her. She sank back onto the bed, draping the blanket over her shoulders, the weight of it grounding her trembling body. The food sat untouched at first, her stomach twisted with grief, but hunger and the memory of the desert slowly broke through. She took a bite, chewing with difficulty through the lump in her throat. The simple meal, the silent offering, felt more precious than any feast she had ever been denied at her family's table. Ethan remained outside on the porch, the faint scrape of his chair shifting now, and then the only sign of his presence. He didn't intrude, didn't press her with questions about her tears. He simply let her keep her dignity. That night, she realized something startling. His silence was not empty. It was respect. For the first time since her family had abandoned her, Isabella accepted a kindness, not out of fear of repayment, but because it was freely given. And though she didn't dare admit aloud, a fragile thread of safety began to weave between her shattered trust and the quiet strength of the man who had found her in the desert. When she finally lay down again, the voices of her family still haunted the edges of her thoughts. But now, alongside them, another voice lingered, the memory of his low, steady words when he had lifted her onto his horse. "You're safe now." For the first time, she wondered if maybe he meant it. Morning light spilled across the ranch, soft and golden, warming the earth that stretched endlessly beyond the cabin. Isabella stepped out into the crisp air, her blanket still wrapped loosely around her shoulders. For the first time since arriving, she paused to really look. The ranch was not grand, but it was steady. Fenced pastures, a small barn, horses grazing with quiet contentment. It wasn't wealth that kept it alive, but care. She turned her gaze and found Ethan already at work, sleeves rolled up, his strong hands looping rope with practiced ease. He didn't notice her at first, or maybe he did and chose not to say. That was his way. Silent, deliberate. She watched as he approached one of the horses, stroking its neck before feeding it grain from his palm. There was no force, no impatience, just a calm steadiness. Even the animal seemed to trust him without hesitation. Isabella hugged the blanket tighter, wondering what it would feel like to trust someone with such ease. Later, she saw him repairing a section of fence, the rhythmic sound of hammer against wood echoing across the yard. She stood at a distance, torn between the urge to help and the instinct to stay invisible. Her family had never trusted her to do anything right. They'd only ever pointed out mistakes. But Ethan glanced up, caught her standing there, and after a moment simply said, "Could use another hand if you'd like." His voice was low, without pressure, more invitation than command. Hesitant, she stepped forward. He handed her a piece of wood to hold steady while he nailed it into place. Her hand shook at first, but he didn't scold when the board slipped. He just adjusted it quietly, tried again, and nodded when she managed to hold it firm. No mocking, no impatient sighs, only a simple, "Thank you." The word struck deeper than she expected, so rare in her life that her eyes pricked with heat. As the day went on, Isabella found herself lingering by his side, watching the rhythm of his work. When she gathered the eggs from the hen house, he said the same words. When she carried a bucket of water from the well, though her arms trembled under the weight, he took it from her with a gentle nod and again said, Thank you. Always steady, always respectful. She realized it wasn't courtesy for him. It was principle. That evening, as they sat by the small fire outside the cabin, Isabella finally dared to speak. Her voice was fragile, but the question pressed too hard to stay hidden. Why do you do that? He looked at her, puzzled. Say thank you, she clarified, her hands twisting in her lap. Most men I've known never bothered. They only took. His eyes lowered to the fire, the flames flickering in their reflection. After a long silence, he said, I protect. I don't hurt. The words were simple, but they carried the weight of something earned, not borrowed. Isabella felt a shiver, not of fear, but of recognition. Ethan lived by a code she had never seen before, one that valued quiet respect over dominance, actions over empty promises. Days turned into a rhythm. She fed chickens while he tended to the horses. She swept the porch while he repaired tools. Sometimes they worked side by side, other times apart, but there was never judgment in his silence. Only patience, only space. And every task she completed, no matter how small, was met with that same steady gratitude. The ranch was not filled with chatter, but with something stronger, the slow building of trust. Isabella found herself breathing easier, her shoulders less tense, her steps less guarded. For the first time in years, she was beginning to believe she had value. Not because she was flawless, but because someone finally treated her as if she mattered. That night, as she lay under the blanket he'd given her, she whispered the words to herself, almost in disbelief. I protect. I don't hurt. Ethan had said it once, but in every gesture, every nod, every thank you, he was proving it true. And for Isabella, whose heart had known only betrayal, it felt like the first fragile stone laid in the foundation of something she had never dared to dream of before, trust. The morning began like any other. Isabella moved quietly about the kitchen, determined to try her hand at cooking breakfast. She had watched Ethan enough times to know where he kept the flour, the skillet, the eggs. But when she cracked the first egg, the yolk slid right off the counter and splattered on the floor. Flustered, she bent to clean it, only to bump her head against the open cupboard. A soft laugh bubbled out of her before she could stop it. Awkward, nervous, but real. The sound startled her. It had been so long since she had heard her own laughter that it felt almost foreign, like a stranger's voice echoing through the cabin. From the doorway, Ethan leaned silently, arms folded across his chest. He didn't laugh aloud, but his lips curved just slightly, the ghost of a smile hidden beneath his rugged features. Isabella noticed him then, her cheeks burning. I'm making a mess, she admitted, half embarrassed. Ethan only stepped forward, picked up the skillet, and said calmly, mess means life, means trying. His words carried no judgment, only a kind of quiet encouragement that made her shoulders ease. Later that afternoon, Isabella wandered toward the corral where a stubborn young horse pawed at the dirt, refusing to let Ethan place the bridle. Without thinking, she approached, whispering softly to the animal. The horse's ears flicked back and forth, but something in her gentle tone calmed it. Slowly, carefully, the animal allowed her to stroke its neck. Ethan stood nearby, still and watchful, as if unwilling to break the moment. When the horse finally stilled enough for the bridle, Isabella's smile spread wide and unguarded. This time, the laugh that escaped her was full, free and pure. Ethan's chest tightened as he watched her, the sight stirring something he thought he had buried long ago. That laughter, light and unpracticed, slipped into the silence of the ranch like sunshine through storm clouds. He didn't say a word, but his eyes softened, carrying a warmth she hadn't seen before. For Isabella, the realization was just as startling. She touched her chest, breath quick and unsteady, because for the first time since her family abandoned her, she felt more than pain. She felt alive. That night, as she lay beneath the quilt, she whispered into the darkness, maybe I wasn't left to die for nothing. The ranch around her no longer felt like a prison of silence. It felt like a place where her broken heart might learn to breathe again. And though Ethan never spoke at his every glance, every quiet gesture told her he felt the same. Sparks of life had returned, not just to her, but to him as well. The small town buzzed with its usual rhythm. Wagons rolling over dusty streets, merchants calling out their wares, children running with sticks clattering against the wooden sidewalks. For most people, it was just another day. But for Isabella, the town felt like a stage where every eye turned to her. She walked beside Ethan as they headed toward the general store for supplies, her chin tucked low, her hands gripping the edge of her shawl. The voices started as whispers, but whispers had a way of spreading like wildfire. "That's her," one woman hissed. "The girl her own kin left to die in the desert." Another voice added with cruel laughter. "No wonder. Look at her. A burden then, a burden now." Each word stabbed at Isabella's chest, reopening wounds she had barely begun to close. Inside the store, the atmosphere didn't soften. A pair of young men leaned against the counter, smirking as she passed. "Guess nobody wanted that bride." One muttered loudly enough for the entire room to hear. The other chuckled. "Poor Cowboy must have picked her up like a stray." The humiliation burned hot on her cheeks. For a moment, she thought her knees might give way, the shame too heavy to carry. Her family's abandonment already haunted her dreams, and now strangers turned those private nightmares into public mockery. She wanted to disappear, to run from their eyes, their words, their judgment. But then she felt it, a steady presence at her side. Ethan didn't speak, not a word, but the weight of his silence carried more than any shout. He stepped closer, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the floor. His hand rested casually on the counter, his body angled in quiet defiance. The room shifted almost instantly. The smirks faltered, the laughter died. The men glanced at one another, then dropped their eyes. No one dared push further. Ethan's silence was not weakness. It was a shield, and under it, Isabella stood a little taller. When they left the store, arms full of supplies, Isabella's heart still trembled with the sting of the gossip. Yet as she glanced sideways at Ethan, she saw his jaw set firm, his eyes sharp with an unspoken vow. He hadn't needed to defend her with words. His presence alone had told the town everything. For the first time in a long while, she realized she didn't have to stand alone against the cruelty of others. Beside him, even silence could be powerful, even silence could be safe. That night, as they unpacked the goods back at the ranch, Isabella's mind replayed the day's events. The cruelty of the whispers still lingered, but stronger than that was a memory of Ethan's quiet strength. She touched the edge of the shawl around her shoulders and breathed deeply. Perhaps she could survive the voices of the world, so long as she had one steady soul who stood for her, even without saying a word. The ranch had begun to feel like a fragile refuge for Isabella, a place where silence wrapped her in safety, where the rhythm of chores and the quiet presence of Ethan gave her strength she hadn't known she still possessed. But peace, like the desert wind, was never permanent. One late afternoon, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in streaks of red, the sound of wagon wheels shattered the calm. Dust rose at the edge of the ranch road, and with it came shadows from her past. Faces she had prayed never to see again. Her relatives. And worse, among them, the man she had once been promised to, his cruel eyes scanning the land as if already claiming what was not his. The air turned heavy with unspoken dread as the men dismounted, boots crunching against the dry earth. One of them sneered, his voice dripping with false authority. "We've come for the girl. She belongs to us. Family rights, unfinished agreements." Another added, "You think you can hide her here? She's ours. And if you don't hand her over, we'll take her by force." Isabella froze on the porch, her breath shallow, her body trembling as though the ground might swallow her whole. Every insult, every cruel word they had ever spat at her returned like knives, useless, unwanted, burden. Her heart screamed to run, but her legs betrayed her, rooted in fear. Ethan stepped forward then, his movements unhurried but unshakable, like a storm cloud settling over the horizon. He said nothing at first, simply positioning himself between Isabella and the intruders, his tall frame a wall of unyielding strength. The tension thickened. One of the men laughed mockingly, trying to mask his unease. Silent as ever, "Cowboy, you think standing there makes her yours?" Ethan's eyes, sharp and steady, locked on them, his voice finally cutting to the heavy air like steel. "She's not leaving, not while I breathe." The ranch fell into a dangerous quiet after his words. Even the wind seemed to still. Isabella's heart pounded, tears stinging her eyes, not just from fear but from shock. Never before had anyone spoken for her. Never before had someone stood between her and the people who had broken her spirit piece by piece. She clutched the edge of her shawl, her body trembling. But for the first time, the trembling wasn't only from terror. It was from the weight of something new, something she had never truly felt before. Protection, belonging, the unspoken promise that she was no longer alone. The intruders hesitated, whispers of doubt flickering across their faces as they measured the cowboy's resolve. They had expected weakness, but instead they found a man who carried his vow in silence, a man who would not move. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as realization settled deep inside her. Ethan wasn't just shielding her body from harm. He was shattering the chains of her past, proving with every heartbeat that she was worth defending. And those shadows had returned to her doorstep. They no longer defined her. The night after the confrontation weighed heavy on Isabella's chest. She sat on the edge of her bed in the small, simple room Ethan had given her, staring at the flickering light of the lantern. Her body still shook, not from the chill of the desert evening, but from the storm inside her. For hours after the intruders had left, her mind replayed Ethan's words over and over. "She's not leaving. Not while I breathe." No one had ever said something like that for her. Her own family had abandoned her, treated her as if she was worth nothing more than a burden to be cast away. And yet, this quiet, scarred cowboy had stood like an unmovable wall for her sake. The weight of that truth was almost too much to bear. Tears began to slide down her cheeks as her emotions cracked open. She pressed her face into her hands, muffling the sobs that poured out, but the sound slipped through the wooden walls. The door creaked softly, and when she looked up, Ethan stood there. His hat was in his hand, his eyes shadowed but steady. He didn't step closer at first, giving her the choice, respecting her space as he always did. "Why?" she choked out through her tears, her voice trembling. "Why would you fight for someone like me? I'm nothing, just a girl who was left behind, unwanted, useless." For a moment, Ethan said nothing, and she thought maybe he didn't have an answer. But then in that low, steady voice of his, he spoke with a quiet conviction that silenced her sobs. "Because actions don't lie," he said. "You matter." His words weren't loud or flowery, but they carried more weight than any speech she had ever heard in her life. He walked forward then, his boots slow against the wooden floor, and in his hands he carried something wrapped in cloth. He set it gently on the table beside her and unwrapped it, revealing a pair of sturdy leather boots, carefully polished, clearly chosen with thought. "They're yours," Ethan said softly, his eyes meeting hers without flinching. "You'll never walk in fear again." Isabella gasped, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch them. To anyone else, they might have been just boots, but to her, they were more than leather and stitching. They were freedom, dignity, and worth. No one had ever given her something without expecting chains in return. No one had ever believed she deserved to stand tall. Her heart swelled painfully in her chest as fresh tears slipped down her face. But this time they weren't just from sorrow. They were from the fragile, overwhelming bloom of hope. Her voice broke as she whispered, "Ethan," but she couldn't find the words. She didn't need to. He stepped closer at last, slowly, carefully, like a man approaching a frightened bird he didn't want to startle. Then, for the first time, she let herself lean forward, let herself fall into the circle of his arms. He held her, not with demand or possession, but with a strength that promised safety. For the first time in her life, Isabella felt what it was to be truly embraced, not as a burden, not as an unwanted girl, but as someone worth holding, worth protecting, worth loving. In the silence of that night, she let her fears bleed out into his steady chest, and in his quiet vow, spoken not just with words, but with every protective breath and steady heartbeat, Isabella finally believed she was no longer alone. The weeks after the confrontation passed in a quiet rhythm that felt almost unreal to Isabella. The ranch, once a place that seemed desolate and cold, slowly began to change. It wasn't sudden, like a storm breaking, but a slow, steady transformation that mirrored the healing in her own heart. Where the fences had been broken, Ethan rebuilt them stronger. Where the horses had once stood restless, they now graze in peace. Wildflowers sprouted along the edges of the dusty path, as if the earth itself had decided to soften for her sake. The land, like her spirit, was no longer barren. It was beginning to bloom again. Each day, Isabella found herself more at home in the chores that had once seemed foreign. She laughed when the chickens scattered at her clumsy attempts to gather eggs, and Ethan's low chuckle followed her like music. She learned how to braid a horse's mane, how to mend a torn saddle strap, how to let her hands find purpose in work instead of trembling in fear. Ethan always thanked her quietly, never commanding, never demanding, just steady gratitude, as if her smallest effort was a gift. And for the first time, Isabella felt what it meant to belong. Her nights of waking with nightmares grew fewer. When shadows from the past threatened to creep in, she remembered Ethan's words, "You'll never walk in fear again." Sometimes, she would step outside beneath the stars and see him sitting by the barn, hat tipped low, keeping watch. She realized then that his silence wasn't emptiness. It was presence, a presence that never failed her, never judged her, never abandoned her. One morning, as the sky began to blush with dawn, Isabella woke earlier than usual. The air was cool, carrying the scent of hay and fresh earth. She stepped softly onto the porch, and there he was, Ethan, sitting on the wooden swing he had built, his figure outlined by the rising sun. He looked over as she approached, and without a word, shifted slightly, leaving space for her beside him. She sat down, her heart strangely light, and for a while they just listened to morning. The soft rustle of leaves, the distant wicker horses, the world waking slowly. Her hands rested in her lap until she felt the quiet weight of his hand finding hers. No words passed between them, but Isabella's chest tightened with a warmth she had never known. For so long, she had believed she was forsaken, cast aside like dust in the desert. But here, in the steady silence of this man who had asked for nothing and given her everything, she realized the truth. She wasn't abandoned. She was chosen. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he didn't move, didn't speak, just let her be. In that stillness, she finally understood that love didn't always need grand gestures or loud declarations. Sometimes it was found in the steady presence of someone who stayed when no one else did. The sun crested higher, bathing them both in golden light, and Isabella closed her eyes, letting the warmth sink into her soul. Her family had left her to die in the desert, but in his silence, she had found a love that would never leave.